I'm Margaret Brennan in Washington, and this week on Face the Nation, the tsunami of activity shaking up Washington and beyond continues, and President Trump prods Ukraine and Russia toward peace. Overnight, the U.S. pounded Iranian-backed Houthi targets in Yemen again, and the backlash grows over the Trump administration's deportation of alleged Venezuelan gang members. We'll talk to White House National Security Advisor Mike Waltz, the head of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, Kentucky Republican Rand Paul, and the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, Connecticut's Jim Himes. It's all just ahead on Face the Nation. I want to ask you closer to home what has been happening here with Tren de Aragua, TDA, we're going to call them, which have been designated by the Trump administration as terrorists. Last Saturday, 238 Venezuelan men were handed over to the government of El Salvador. 137 of them were deported using this rarely used 1789 Alien Enemies Act. This is important because it gives the power to detain and deport without a court hearing first, if they come from countries at war with the U.S. In the hearing on Friday, it was revealed that El Salvador, where they're being held, rejected two of the people. One, on the basis of gender, because it was a woman and they can't be held at a maximum security prison. The other, because the person wasn't even Venezuelan at all. How does that kind of high consequence mistake happen?
Well, these kind of one-offs we'll deal with on an individual basis. But, Margaret, the underlying issue here is twofold. So there was a mistake that you acknowledge I can't speak to those individual cases and the details of the individual cases. But what I can speak to is President Trump has determined that this group is acting as a terrorist organization. It is terrorizing our communities through attacks, torture, rape, and the most awful of situations for those communities, number one. And number two, the Alien and Sedition Act fully applies because we have also determined that this group is acting as a proxy of the Maduro regime. So
I'm sorry, just to clarify on that. This is supposed to apply if the U.S. is at war with a country. You are saying you have evidence that the government of Venezuela is directing these gangs?
We are saying that TDA is acting as a proxy of the Maduro regime. This is how the Alien and Sedition Act applies. And we cannot have district judges interfering with the commander-in-chief's actions to take care of, in the way he deems necessary, a terrorist organization.
So the U.S. is at war
and I got to tell you,
Venezuela?
we can debate on Article 2, Article 3. That's a fair debate. However, in this case, the commander-in-chief, President Trump, is taking decisive action to rid our communities of these gangs that are operating in a paramilitary fashion, and that we know Maduro is deliberately emptying his prisons in a proxy manner to influence and attack the United States.
But that's so different.
That's how
the U.S. is not at war with the country of Venezuela. I know the Attorney General said on another network she thinks this is going to go to the Supreme Court.
Sure, that's
you
fine.
Want to have this
but
fight.
Margaret, we have instances where the IRGC from Iran have operated to buy with and through Mexican cartels to then bomb facilities here in the United States. We've taken decisive action in that regard. We're going to take decisive action in this regard. And we're making a Washington, D.C. distinction when the American people are tired of being terrorized by these gangs.
No one is defending gangs, but
but it sounds like it. It certainly sounds like it from the Democrats on the other side. And it sounds like in the case of this judge that wanted to turn a flight around full of gang members that had intelligence packets that had determined what they're doing.
There was a woman sent to a man's prison, and El Salvador said no.
I mean,
so it's the question of if you are suspending the ability to have a day in court, that you get the list right. That you can verify that these people are gang members.
Look, every one of them were here illegally. So first of all, we had every right and should deport every one of these individuals. If you want to make a special case for one, that's fine. But underlying that is the Alien Act that has determined that commander-in-chief has the absolute authority to do this.
We'll talk. And we turn now to Kentucky Republican Senator Rand Paul. He is the chair of the Homeland Security Committee, and he joins us this morning from Bowling Green, Kentucky. Good morning to you, Senator.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Sure. Because of your role in Homeland Security, I want to follow up where we left off with National Security Advisor Waltz. There are legal questions around using these authorities to send out detainees without giving them a day in court. But there's also just questions of how it's being handled in regard to these individuals who were rejected by El Salvador, one for gender, one because they weren't Venezuelan at all. Does any of this concern you, along with claims from their family members that many of these people weren't gang members?
You know, there are some big legal questions here. On the one hand, the Bill of Rights applies to everyone, to persons. The Bill of Rights doesn't specifically designate citizens. It's really anyone in the United States the Bill of Rights applies to. On the other hand, the Alien and Enemies Act simply says you really don't get much process. The president can simply declare that you are somehow a problem for foreign policy and opposed to our foreign policy, and you can be deported. So really, ultimately, this goes to the court, and then the court's going to have to decide, are they going to declare unconstitutional a law that's been around for a couple hundred years, or are they going to defer to Congress? If you look at the TikTok decision recently, which I don't agree with, but in the TikTok decision, the court basically said, we're going to defer to Congress. Congress says this is about national security, and who are we to question Congress?
Right, and then the president issued an executive order that defied what Congress did.
Right. But my point is I think the court should have ruled on the First Amendment with regard to TikTok and not said, oh, well, whatever Congress wants. But if you look at the TikTok decision and you had to guess what the Supreme Court's going to do, my guess is they'll uphold the Alien and Enemies Act. It's not necessarily my position, but I think the court will uphold it. So it's at least debatable on both sides who's right or who's wrong here. And I think it's not correct for Democrats to simply say, oh, it's constitutional chaos. There's no leg to stand on. There actually is legal authority on the one hand that's been around for over 200 years.
But just, we're not talking about partisan politics. We're talking about the courts right now and what the judge said he had questions about, and talks about this being done, essentially in the cover of night. This seems to be an argument the administration wants to have go to the Supreme Court. Are you comfortable with bypassing what you described as, what's guaranteed in the Bill of Rights, a day in court, or at least some verification that some of these people actually are guilty in some way of what they're accused of, which is membership in a gang?
So we have a contradiction. We basically have the Constitution that says everyone, persons in the United States, have due process rights, have the Bill of Rights on their side. But we also have law that has been in power for 200 years saying, oh, well, except for when the president wants to deport people. So these are in conflict. There will have to be some decision making. On the question of whether or not a district judge can make a ruling for the whole country, that's also a very big question. And I suspect as this works its way up to the Supreme Court, when you get to the Supreme Court, I do believe the Supreme Court is going to limit district judges from having nationwide rulings. So I think that's also in the offing. But these are huge legal questions, and the only way they begin is by a challenge. If the president doesn't challenge these, they never have standing and never get to court. So on the one hand, the president is generating this, but it's the only way to generate a final conclusion from the court.
It just sounds, these are debates for law professors, certainly. But in the meantime, there are individuals who may have been sent wrongly to these facilities that are outside the U.S. jurisdiction. Are you comfortable, as the man with oversight, as chair of the committee, with what's being done?
I think the courts will rule that there has to be some process. I don't think you are going to be able to deport people.
You're comfortable with it?
So no, I don't think you're answering for me. I think there is going to be some process afforded by the courts for representation before you're deported in most cases. I don't know about the ones under the Alien and Enemies Act, and I'm not sure anybody knows that. And while I love constitutional law, I'm not a constitutional lawyer, I do think it goes to the Supreme Court, and there are arguments to be made on both sides of this question.
Got it. Welcome back to Face the Nation. We turn now to the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, Connecticut Congressman Jim Himes. He joins us this morning from Greenwich. Good morning to you. I want to jump right into it on the conversation about this Venezuelan gang. You have said some of your fellow Democrats have been too quick to use the term constitutional crisis. But because of the use of the Alien Enemies Act and this gang, you have started to become concerned that's where we are. Can you explain that?
Yeah, that's right, Margaret, and thanks for having me. You know, constitutional crisis is a sort of broadly used term. Lots of people have different definitions for it. It's a lot of stuff you don't like. I'll tell you what I know is a constitutional crisis. If the President of the United States decides to ignore the orders of a court. We have not seen that since Andrew Jackson did that in 1834. When that happens, you have a supine, on its back Congress of the United States, completely beholden to the president, not acting as a check. And if the president says, I don't care what the courts say, which, by the way, he has not said, but which Tom Homan, his czar for deportations, has said, now you have a full-blown constitutional crisis. So I think these next couple of days, as we see how this administration goes after the many judges and the many courts, many of these judges appointed by Republican presidents who are stopping the wild and illegal actions of this administration, we're going to see whether we are in a true, Jacksonian constitutional crisis.
Because of your role on the Intelligence Committee, I know you have some visibility into the assessments of U.S. intelligence. The New York Times reported that the intelligence community said with moderate confidence that the gang, TDA, that we've been talking about, is not directed by the Venezuelan government. However, the National Security Advisor just told us on this program TDA is acting as a proxy of the Venezuelan government. Why does that distinction matter?
Yeah, well, it doesn't matter, and I'll come back around to that. But look, what people worry about is that this administration acts with a unbelievable kind of cocktail of incompetence and illegality. When you fire all of the people at the Department of Energy who look after our nuclear weapons and then say, oopsie, we need to hire you back, that's incompetence. I listened to Mike. Mike is a friend of mine. I have respect for Mike, but what he did was dodge your question. I'm not a lawyer, but I can read the first paragraph of the Aliens Enemy Act, which says very clearly that the authority that this administration claims is dependent on a declaration of war, not on acting as a proxy. So Mike distorted the law, and I read the New York Times article too. I haven't seen specific intelligence about whether there's any connection whatsoever between Venezuela and the TDA gang, but you're right. The New York Times, by the way, I'll get an answer on this tomorrow, and I'm going to have some questions for Mike. The New York Times, of course, reported that that the intelligence community believes that there's not a meaningful connection between Venezuela and the TDA gang. So again, it's a bizarre combination of acting incompetently, because maybe there's a Venezuelan hairdresser, a gay Venezuelan hairdresser with no connection to TDA, and if he's in this country illegally, fine, deport him. But to do it in this way under authorities that are not legal is not the way to do this.
You're referring there to some reporting in Time magazine about what happened to some of these, one particular detainee. On Friday, the Justice Department announced a criminal investigation into what they described as the leak of classified intelligence about this group, TDA. The Deputy Attorney General said they won't tolerate politically motivated efforts by the deep state to undercut President Trump's agenda by leaking false information to the New York Times. Do you have any concern, or is there concern within the intelligence community about these leaks?
There's always concerns about leaks, Margaret, and as ranking member of the Intelligence Committee, I don't care who a leak benefits, whether it benefits Joe Biden or Donald Trump or whatever. They are not okay. They are violations of the law. It's very interesting, though, that characterization that you just read, that we will not tolerate leaks that are inconsistent with President Trump's agenda. And this gets at one of my worst fears with respect to the national security apparatus under Donald Trump. Everything is about Donald Trump, right? And where I work, inside and overseeing the intelligence community, it is absolutely essential that the intelligence community be about one thing and one thing only, which is giving Donald Trump and other national leaders unvarnished, unbiased advice. And if this is all about serving the president's agenda, that is a notion that is completely at odds with what the intelligence community and what we spend $90 billion on making sure that policymakers, the president chief amongst them, has good information.
I was listening to. We return now to the Venezuelan deportation case, and for what's next, we're joined by our Justice Department correspondent Scott McFarland and our immigration reporter Camilo Montoya Galvez. It's good to have you both here. Camilo, you did some extraordinary reporting this week and obtained the names of the migrants who were sent to El Salvador. That's information that the administration refused to share with the federal judge, but you got it. What did you learn?
We're still investigating every single case on this list of 238 Venezuelan men who were sent to El Salvador to be in prison there. But this is what we know. We know that according to court filings and also our own findings here at CBS News, some of the people on this list do have criminal histories in the U.S. or abroad in countries like Peru, Chile, and Colombia. But we also know that according to the government, many of these people do not have any criminal record in the U.S. And we have received documents from lawyers and attorneys and also the family members of the deportees who say that these people, some of them, do not have any criminal history in the U.S. But the administration is accusing all of them of being part of this transnational gang known as Tren de Aragua. But how that accusation is being made is at the center of this story. The administration says they have used intelligence and other techniques to identify these people as suspected TDA members, but their relatives and their lawyers say that some of these men were identified as TDA simply because of tattoos.
And that is really where we get to the legal nub of this argument is, can you, as Senator Paul was saying, bypass the right to a day in court on the basis of someone having some tattoos? So, Scott, the Trump administration is going to have this appeal tomorrow, as I understand it. You were in federal court Friday when the judge said it was, quote, awfully frightening how the administration stretched the law. They are looking for this fight.
There's two different fights they're looking for. The legal is one of them. They're going to be in the appeals court tomorrow. They'll go to the Supreme Court potentially eventually, trying to consolidate power to make it an 18th century reality right now where you can expel people who are locked up currently on U.S. soil without having to go through the courts, even though the courts are trying to catch mistakes and make sure nobody's scooped up erroneously.
Even though you could deport them anyhow.
You could still deport them anyhow. That's one fight they're looking to fight. There's also the political one, Margaret. There is so much political upside to all of this for the Trump administration. And you heard that from the National Security Advisor a few moments ago when he told you this is a D.C. distinction, that the administration is not exactly concerned about looking too aggressive in deporting suspected gang members. There's all kinds of wins there. And then there's the other one, Margaret, the villainization of Washington, D.C. federal judges, which can galvanize the conservative base and the Trump base. And you saw that Friday in the courtroom with the judge, James Boasberg, pushing back on the president's allegations that he just wants to set these gang members free. The judge said, they're still locked up. You can deport them the normal way without invoking this 18th century law. Let's see how much more pushback there is from the president to this judge. There was more overnight on Truth Social.
Yes, he's spoken about it. He's posted about this judge raising other concerns. Camilo, though, you actually have reported out what was done behind the scenes to bring this all to a head, to set up this fight. What did you learn?
What I can tell you is that based on conversations with DHS sources, the administration was actively preparing for this operation well before the president actually signed this proclamation, unbeknownst to the public last Friday, before the White House actually published the actual proclamation on Saturday, March 15, and before those planes took office.
As quickly as possible.
That's right. They stage a roundup across the country of suspected TDA members and transfer those people to a Texas detention center. And by the time the judge held the first emergency hearing on this case, there were already 2 planes in the air and another one ready to take off.
Knowing that they might have to face a fight back in the courts. Scott, the president has issued at least 3 executive orders that we have clocked impacting private law firms who represented clients at odds with President or then Mr. Trump. That's bad for private business. One of those law firms cut a deal, $40 million. What's the impact here?
I talked to one of the lawyers who's been targeted by one of these actions. He says they're trying to take me off the playing field. They're trying to take others off the playing field as we continue to challenge the administration in court. A chilling effect to make it harder to file these lawsuits that have been the firewall so far in the Trump administration. But there's a distinction in the latest round of actions. prohibiting these law firms based in Washington from doing business in government buildings or with government employees. That is a death sentence for a Washington, D.C. law firm. In fact, one of those firms, Perkins Coie, the ones challenging this in court, said as much to the judge. This would kill us. And the judge here in Washington has for now held off on the Trump executive action to strip Perkins Coie. But we'll see how long that protection lasts.
Mm-hmm. And this has knock-on effects for others seeking legal services, but also, as you said, makes them hard to just function.
Especially the stripping of security clearances,
yes.
Margaret, that makes it harder for a whistleblower at the FBI or the CIA or the Pentagon to find a lawyer to blow the whistle. Makes it possible such whistles will not be blown.
Right, because they need to seek counsel who have ability to deal with classified information. Camilo, the administration announced Friday they're revoking legal status of 500,000 migrants who came here legally from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela during President Biden's terms. This is another fight they wanted to have. Mm-hmm. But if the stated intention is to go after the worst of the worst and deport them, why focus on people who bothered to be here legally?
Well, the administration would argue that the Biden administration abused its immigration executive authority to create this program without Congress, and that the people who came here under this policy are undercutting American workers, and that they are essentially illegal immigrants as well. And now they are turning them into illegal immigrants by stripping them of their legal status, their work permits, or deportation protections. Right now, they have, for the next 30 days, a chance to self-deport through a smartphone app. If they don't do that, DHS is warning that they will be found, arrested, and deported from the country. And this crackdown on immigration by the administration is also extending to other parts of the immigration system. We also know that the administration is suspending funding, federal funding, for legal services providers and lawyers who help migrant children who have left federal custody or who are still in federal custody and who are facing deportation.
And this is all intentional, that taking funding away even from migrant kids?
This administration does not believe that federal funds should be used for people who are in the country illegally or without legal permission.
Gentlemen, you're going to be busy. Thank you for breaking it all down for us. I appreciate it.